take the mouse. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organization, and thank you very much for the invitation as well. I will be extremely fast to stick militantly to my talking time now. Let me perhaps start just with a basic empirical clarification before coming actually to my presentation itself. We have just heard, and I think it holds true for Eastern Europe, that the voters, the supporters of the radical right or the extreme right, tend to be well-educated, middle-class people. When we come to Western Europe, this is certainly very different. The terms that usually appear in the literature, in the political science literature, to depict these voters are terms such as losers of modernization or the poor souls, as David Art has recently called them. Austria, and now I get onto my presentation, in that sense, has a very, very high blue-collar worker support when it comes to right-wing voting. So I think we have to just consider that it's not just well-educated middle-class people, but especially in Central Europe, if we consider Austria Central Europe, rather low-educated people. Let me start with my short talk now. It is called tentative alignment, first of all, because tentative is a good word to describe Austrian politics, and alignment, I think, is a good term to describe more or less the policy discourse when it comes to issues of immigration and integration in Austria. I will explain this later on, but now let me just outline what I'm going to do. I will start with a short contextualization of the study, then I will explain the findings, and then I will very briefly touch upon a few implications, that is, recommendations that we can derive from our findings. This study, by the way, was made under the coordination of Rob Cohen, his think tank. And the starting point was really to disambiguate the discourse on immigration integration policy with respect to the political mainstream on one hand and the radical right or the extreme right on the other hand. I will stick to the term extreme right for my presentation, even though there are lots of ways of conceptualizing that. But now let's move on. Let me start with the context. As perhaps all of you know, we have a very electorally strong extreme right party, which is the Freedom Party, the Freiheitliche Partei, FPÖ. In the last national elections of 2008, it won 17.8% of the total vote, which is quite a lot, I think, in a comparative perspective. And quite importantly, what commentators, especially foreign commentators, tend to overlook, I think it's perfectly fine that they don't care about Austrian regional politics, but in the very important Vienna elections of 2010, the Freedom Party came in second place with 25.8% of the total vote, which is a quite astonishing result in the light of the persistence, or at least the hitherto persistence of the Red Vienna, as we know it, so the Social Democratic city government. Secondly, a very, very important thing in Austria, as you all know as well, between 2000 and 2006 we had the so-called black-blue/black-blue-orange government, so basically a coalition government consisting of the moderate conservative People's Party and the extreme right FPÖ, the Freedom Party, first, and then after they split, because of a lot of internal grievances, there was the Alliance for the Future of Austria as well involved in the this legacy is, I think, a very tentative issue again, which I will discuss it in a minute. But before that, I think it's very important to note, and I'm not doing policy analysis, but discourse analysis. From a policy analysis perspective, Austria has a very, very restrictive immigration and integration policy regime. So certainly, and that's the second point, we have to consider that policies didn't change that much after all in the period between 2000 and 2006, where the far right was in office. But there are two common narratives, which seem to recur when it comes to the influence of the extreme right in Austrian politics, especially with respect to immigration and integration. The first narrative, I would call it the journalistic narrative. That's what you read in everyday newspapers, especially one with a perhaps leftist or liberal bent, is the rise of the extreme right has led to more restrictive immigration integration policy. There is no clear causality here. We're not speaking in terms of political scientific analysis, but we're speaking about, I think, a basic intuition that with the normalization, with the government participation of an extreme right party, certainly a certain discourse, which emphasizes being very restrictive, has become even more accepted. And we found that, or you keep finding that if you want, if you look at statements of moderate conservative parties, of the moderate conservative party in Austria. The narrative too, which is perhaps rather the policy analysis narrative, is rather dry, namely there's marginal direct policy influence apart from 2006 to 2006 when the extreme right was actually in government and could actually influence politics and policy making. So in the end we don't know much because it's very difficult to really choose sides here. I don't go to choose one of the sides, but it's very likely that first of all the discourse has shifted to the right. The discourse has, by the way, as I would say, it's almost commonplace in political science, especially after 9/11, generally shifted to the right when it comes to immigration and integration policy in Western Europe. And secondly, policy changed, but the extreme right is one of many factors. There's one very good study by other political scientists who actually did the policy analysis of Austria with respect to what happened in the time of the extreme right participation in government. And he finds actually that there's not really a big difference to the policies, first, that were made before in Austria, and second, the policies that were made elsewhere in Europe during the time that is after 9/11, essentially. So that in mind, our main idea is really to disambiguate the discourse. What we did before I reflect upon the findings, we did employ quantitative and qualitative variables. The qualitative variables tell us obviously about the content of what this research is really about. I will not really bore you with that. I will spare you these issues. I will just briefly reflect on the most important points. The quantitative variables, I will get to them, they measure the restrictiveness of policy discourse on one hand, and on the other hand, they measure political justification, which I will explain more. First, consensus exists on three issues among all parties, so the mainstream, all parties under scrutiny, of course, leaving out the Green parties, that has to be said, but between the mainstream, the political mainstream, and the extreme right in Austria. These three issues of consensus are first, the priority of linguistic integration. That's, I guess, also a bit of a no-brainer these days. Second, we have to restrict immigration. I guess that's something that all parties tentatively agreed on in recent months, especially the moderate conservatives have decided that they really want to restrict immigration, or at least impose certain completely new criteria of more qualified immigration and so on and so on. The third point, which is perhaps surprising to find if you don't look at form but at content of policy statements, is that Islam is in tension with core Western values. All parties seem to agree on that. I will come to that in a second. What's important, I guess, on a general note, is that policy positions tend to be quite restrictive. Clearly, the Freedom Party, the far right, is most restrictive on all their policy issues. And an even more important point is perhaps that mainstream parties struggle to find a policy line. They struggle to really make a case for why do certain things and not others. Especially the why question, as we will see in a bit, is very crucial here. So the findings, I see the table is just a bit scattered here. The findings, we have a factor, we have a scale between -2 and +2, and it's just a brief glance at it really. But we see that the Freedom Party is most restrictive on all the issues we have measured, and the Social Democratic Party, perhaps unsurprisingly, is least restrictive, even though it has to be noted that the 1.0, which is a very, very, I think, non-restrictive coefficient here, it has to do with the fact that there, as I believe, are only two or three frames quoted. But now to the issue of justification. You might wonder why measure justification, and I mean I can give you a good reason from political theory which says that politics have to be based on the justification of what you do. You have to say why it's good that you do a policy, why should we do it. And the percentage of justification varies very starkly between the political parties. And if we look at the discourse of immigration integration policy, we find that in 75.3% of the cases, the Freedom Party gives a clear case, makes a case for why their position is good, why you should vote them, whereas the other parties, as they struggle to find a line, are really far below that. So you never have a real reasoned argument. And that is perhaps also because they react a lot to what the extreme right does, and just in points adopt their issues, adopt their topics, adopt their positions even. And then that's quite interesting. How are the policy positions justified? Let me explain this. A pragmatic justification would be we need to constrain immigration because of, say, financial issues. We cannot provide the welfare, we cannot provide housing for asylum seekers, and so on and so on. These would be a pragmatic, economic, if you want, justification. An identity-based justification is really taking our own core values. We want to do this, we suggest this policy is right because we're Czech, we're Hungarian, we're Austrian, you name it. And a moral universal justification is one that appeals to certain issues like human rights. Why should we do this? Because it's a greater ideal that we serve with this policy. And let me just reflect on that. Of course, we find lots of pragmatic framings, lots of pragmatic arguments in the discourse on immigration and integration. And I mean, I guess, at least a bit counterintuitively, quite a few of them stem from the Freedom Party itself, even though it's also leading on the identity-based scale. Identity-based arguments are really rare in Austria, apart from the Freedom Party, which of course endorses the type of Austrian nationalism that other parties just don't endorse. And lastly, the moral universal dimension, which I think is very important, is commonly invoked when it comes to issues of Islam. I said before that Islam is more or less commonsensically seen by all the three parties as in some ways threatening core Western values. And the argument in 90% of the cases, roughly speaking, but that's pretty much what we measured, is that Islam is obviously hostile to all the emancipation rights of women, to women's rights in itself, that we have established as a core value of Western modern democracies. And in that sense, moral universal frames appear within all parties, especially, as you can see, within the Social Democratic Party in the middle, the red one, which often makes the case that women's rights are just generally undervalued and particularly threatened by Islam. So, to wrap up, really, I think we need to consider a couple of broad implications. I'm racing through this now, and I hope I'm not too fast, but I'm just within my time frame. I have 5 minutes, that's good. I'll be even quicker. I think that there are three issues which have to be considered as a result of this. I have noted very briefly, and we can discuss that hopefully later, that parties, mainstream parties, those who have the power actually to, from a moderate perspective, counter the rise of the extreme right, lack any clear policy position. They react to what the far right does, and they don't really justify their policy positions. So I guess the first step, which is more intuitive perhaps than it might seem to most, is to clarify a normative positioning on the part of political mainstream. First of all, you have to develop a clear stance on immigration and integration, which especially in Austria, the Social Democrats have failed to do. If you follow really what has been written in the newspapers alone, you will see that there has been absolutely no clear issue and lots of party infights, even factionalism, because the federal system in Austria really invites that you take on the leaders in the capital. But no clear positioning at all. No clear positioning at all. And to give you just a little contrast, a normative positioning of a party means that you link what you say to the core values of the party. And I guess if a party doesn't have core values, then it probably doesn't have a real place in politics, because if we only do evidence-based politics, as it is called today, if we only deal with public opinion alone, then obviously we would need a whole variety of political parties. So we have to consider these values as parties, as partisans, once we want to develop a stance on immigration integration. From that follows that you have to act and not react to the extreme right. A reaction to the extreme right would be what happens usually. The extreme right issues a policy statement and the other parties just condemn it. Other than that, I suppose it has to be an active trying to make statements about what is right, what is wrong. In terms of politics, or what we suggest is right, or what we suggest is wrong, what is desirable. That you have to connect, and that's the third point, in a clear reason statement, which doesn't happen at all when you look at the mainstream discourse with respect to immigration, integration in Austria. It doesn't happen at all. You have to avoid the neutral statements, you have to stick to your core values, your party's core values, and say why. And from this, I think we have a pretty clear idea of a communication strategy, and I have analyzed discourse and not policy itself, of how to tackle the problem of extreme right in Austria. And I finish here, and I hope we have a lively discussion afterwards. It has been very brisk, I know, but I was trying to stick to the time.
Thank you.